Great. Aloha, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in the room and online today for a community workshop. I'm Katie Hansen with the Public Finance Initiative, and we're delighted to be here to support the East Maui Water Authority as they're working towards thinking through how to find projects that bring community benefits and different funding and financing strategies. So our agenda for today is we'll start with an opening and grounding in purpose. We'll provide a little bit of an introduction to who PFI is, and then turn it over to Director Young from the East Maui Water Authority to provide a bit of an update. Then we'll hear a bit about infrastructure strategies and financing strategies for projects in the water system and watershed, and then move into a discussion about identifying specific projects that will help meet community needs. We'll close with some reflections on the path forward and next steps. And so moving into our opening and grounding, I'm delighted to introduce Lourdes German, our Executive Director at the Public Finance Initiative.
Thank you, Katie. It's such an honor to be here. We're thrilled just to be supporting Gina, the East Maui Water Authority, and all of you. Hopefully it will be a really meaningful participatory process. And I will tell you a little bit about what we do. And as a Public Finance Initiative, we're here as a very small team. So my colleagues, Alex Brunn and Katie Hansen, who you just met, in addition to me, and those who you see on the screen, do our work every day with communities across America. Specifically, we've worked with over 46 governments in 46 states, over 400 states, localities, and counties who, similar to Gina and the East Maui Water Authority, really care about centering values in the public finance decision-making process, where they think about what are we financing with a question and commitment to really thinking about place-based outcomes. And as an organization, we're here to really support Gina with technical assistance and capacity building at a really important inflection point, as we're going to talk about today, where the water system has the opportunity to set a new vision and really think about governance differently. And oh, thank you. Thank you. I think it's wonderful to be here. And the program specifically that this time, as we're back, we're supporting Gina in, is the Rural and Small Cities program that Katie leads, where we work with governments who are serving small and rural populations, including cities, towns, and also other jurisdictions that are facing systemic barriers to funding, particularly where we see a pattern of disinvestment and where there's a desire to shift that. And the program provides 2 levels of support, including technical assistance and capacity building, which we'll talk more about throughout this session. And we are here with the generosity of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who generously supports this program, and the avenues of support that we'll be discussing, we're providing to Gina and the authority. And with that, I will turn it over to Gina to share the goals that we are seeing on this slide and so much more, which is what brings us to this room.
Thank you, Lourdes. Aloha and good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Thanks to everybody online. I'm Gina Young. I'm the director of the East Maui Water Authority. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to my staff and introduce them. We have Corey DeSens, who's right there, who is also our board chair, and our board secretary, and my secretary, and Serena Fukushima, who's in the back, who's all of my staff has done so much work to get the department up and running, but also to get these series of meetings going. We have Mary Eliza Beaumont right there. And then we have Leslie Tamarabuchi, who's our grant coordinator. So anybody that has questions about our grant program, it's still open right now, and she may give a pitch at the end of the meeting for that. I also want to give a very special thank you to my board. And we have our board chair here tonight, Dr. Jonathan Scheuer. And I'm gonna he's right. He's hidden in the crowd, but we're giving him a wave right now to thank him. That his knowledge of water resource management across the Paʻaina it's invaluable, and his ability to impart wisdom in a clear, meaningful way is so appreciated and frankly really impressive and impactful. He'll come up in a few minutes, but before that, I just also want to say thank you to the Public Finance Initiative for coming out and for introducing us to this Rural and Small Cities program, which is a unique program designed for communities like ours to build in a community benefit component into the work that we do, and then to help us expand our view of funding. So she will go into much more detail about that in a minute. PFI came out for our first round of community meetings in June. And when we met then, our lens was much broader. We just wanted to get the vision of what people had and just get anything that was on their mind. And from that, we got a lot of really useful information, including, let me check my slides. Hold on a second. Including, we heard that our community members are exhausted from being excluded from decisions that shape their lives. We heard that they are experiencing, and the watershed is experiencing, unprecedented drought, historical drought. And they are telling us that we must manage our water resources more efficiently, more equitably. We heard the message really loud and clearly that we're at a turning point and we can't wait for change anymore. So before we jump into part 2 of our community conversations, which is today where we narrow that lens, I just want to recap real quickly, go through the slides. So this is our whole, you go from vision to implementation. The first meeting was about vision. In June, we heard summaries of themes across all the different meetings that we were at that were focused on community control, access, fairness, infrastructure needs, investment, not just in East Maui, but all across the island, nothing new. Cultural stewardship and the value that that brings. Education and knowledge and being able to transfer that down to the next generation, and the importance of civic engagement. Making sure that we focus on and that we have the tools we need to create better environmental and ecosystem health, and then calls for good governance, transparency, and accountability. So specifically, when we were in KNI, their themes were based around having a culturally focused stewardship of our water resources, of both the system management as well as the watershed. And they really want a robust local watershed workforce to restore the health there. It's going to take a lot more than what we're doing right now. And we can do it in partnership and bring added value to what's already happening. They also talked a lot about the importance of transferring the knowledge to the next generation. And that's something we'll talk about as we get more into what kind of programs can we develop. Now, when we went up to Kula, that's another community that's faced lack of water, a long history of it. For them, they're a water user. It's water meters, it's water infrastructure, and how that lack of water really affects their community, because it brings in new people that can afford to do infrastructure that sometimes long-time residents aren't able to do. And that really changes the dynamics of a community, and equity to water can shape the community in a way that it's not really the best. Again, focuses on infrastructure and water quality, and then a distrust towards government, and a real frustration towards a lack of information and policymaking that really doesn't benefit their needs at a rate that they'd like to see it. I know there's been a lot of progress with the Department of Water Supply in the past couple of years, and a lot of transparency and accountability, and that's been wonderful to see. When we went out to Haiku and talked to the Haiku Huelo community out there, they talked a lot about the loss of cultural practices that came with the loss of access to the streams and watershed, and really grief about kind of a dying watershed and how that's affected their ability to cultivate kalo and use the area spiritually and recreationally, and how they couldn't bring their children out to the watershed the way that it had been when they were growing up, and that they're firsthand feeling that climate change. And it's a real heavy burden and feeling that they feel in their communities, especially as the diversions continue to deplete the streams. And they hear that streams have been restored, but then they look themselves in their backyards and they don't see any water. And that, again, it breeds mistrust and skepticism about what they're hearing from policymakers too. So today, we're not going to repeat what we did. We're going to try to dial that lens down and look now at project identification and community priorities. But I wanted to, we're going to talk, we added a fourth topic once we heard that the Board of Land and Natural Resources at their November 14th meeting are going to take up a recommendation from the DLNR to hold a contested case over the long-term water disposition. We're not exactly sure how that works. We haven't seen it before, but it does mean it's going to kick it out of the ability for the parties to negotiate with each other. It's going to go to a quasi-judicial process that really doesn't benefit transparency and doesn't allow the parties to keep talking to each other. So we added a fourth category today. So we'll want to get your thoughts on system ownership and management. And when you're thinking about that, think what do you want to say to the policymakers when they're charged with making decisions that really affect your life? So I'm going to give you last night, I'm going to give you an update on what happened there. We're going to come back with a lot more information. I just wanted to do a broad overview today, but no, we will have more information at probably our next board meeting in November. We can dive in a little deeper and include today's discussion. But what we heard in K&I with our first topic, which was water system improvements for efficiency and longevity. We always hear system repair so that there's more efficiency in there, but we also heard a desire to include the allies in infrastructure and to maximize their operations and to better understand how those systems are interconnected with each other. Even though they can go across property lines, if there's a problem in one part of that system, it affects the whole system and it affects the water flowing out to the near shore ecosystem. There's a lot of talk about monitoring and stream gauges and rainfall stations and how that is a critical part of moving forward and understanding what's happening. There's a need for hydrology and scientific training and desire for the community, but also for Maui to have some of that knowledge with their own staff. So they're not just relying on a state that's already stretched really thin. And then there's also monitoring to include the quality of life and the health of the community as it relates to the ecosystem and water resource management. And I think that's often forgot when we talk about monitoring. The second topic that we talked about was base yard operations. And that was so great to hear from a community that's already doing the work to help us understand what do we need to get in there to help them do the work in the watershed. And they came up with some great ideas about personnel that included not only laborers, but again, the scientific staff that can go up there and really understand and then translate for the public to understand what the watershed health is. And then again, training for community members and what an educational component. Even though they know a lot of it intuitively, they like to learn the scientific language so they can also communicate to policymakers. And equipment, they were very specific about what kind of equipment we need, and I was very grateful to hear that. And then also we discussed something called an equipment loan program, which we talked about a little further out, maybe 3 to 5 years, but there's a lot of property owners that have the stream in their backyard. And it's a lot for them individually to go out and get the equipment they need to do the work that's done. But if we could come up with a program, and then they expanded that to a personnel loan program. We're hearing kids aren't as industrious as they used to be, and you can't really rely on them. So if we were able to incorporate in there that we could also kind of loan out some personnel to help them. And then again, the allies they talked about, if we could also focus on helping with that. On our topic of watershed management, that was a great discussion. There's going to be a lot more on this. I just condensed it into these couple points here. And reforestation and invasive species are always a top focus. Everybody knows that. But there was also some new information about encouraging current studies of the watershed by students and just more, again, education on understanding just what is this unique special environment, what endemic species do we have up there, and how can we better understand them. There's already, I think we heard that BYU comes up there occasionally, and that I didn't know that. That was great to hear. And then some HANA students come up. So they wanted more partnering with that. There was talks about trying to create a food web and looking at everything systemically. And then incorporating native plant corridors in there. Again, the monitoring and having staffing so they can really go up and look and not just having the occasional state person come. And then there was a discussion about aquatic bridges. I know there's a better name for it. We'll have our expert talk about that to help the migration over the diversions. One of the things that the Commission on Water Resource Management has talked about is that there's a desire to have the species be able to go up and down the streams. But when you have a diversion, it creates an impediment, and in other places to face that. So they literally build, bridges or ways for that stream life to continue its movement that's necessary for the life cycle. And then again, there's this discussion that everything is connected and nearshore ecosystems benefit from the stream flows, but we really need education about all of that. And then lastly, system ownership and operations. And I mean, it was local control now, no more delays. I mean, really, what more can we say about that? There was discussions about Maui residents voted for local control. They don't like to see private ownership of the system. They feel it's something that should be in the hands of the people. There was discussion about acquisition through eminent domain. The state, they feel, is not acting in the best interest of East Maui residents. They were very clear about that. It seems obvious what should be done, but yet what were the actions we're seeing being taken are not beneficial to us. And also DHHL beneficiaries need to be included and represented in any agreement. And we couldn't agree more. Our board chair is a representative of DHHL and an expert, and we reserve a board seat. So we were able to explain that. So when we had everybody do the priorities, the top projects, it was so great to see it all condensed down into something that gives us direction. And the top two were upgrade physical infrastructures. No surprise there that that's the top. There's more detail on specifically what they'd like to see, but they live there. They see it every day when they go up. It's an old system. Everybody knows that. And then also, I was surprised to see that the base yard to them was the top. These were the two top things. And they want local staff operating the system and doing the watershed work. And their slogan was create our own EMI, but do it the way that you're supposed to do it. So we really like that. There was also ideas were to develop a culturally based operational model. For any of you that have been following the work we've been doing with Kumu Pono, it's a cultural report and library that they're giving us that we're getting up on our website. It's one of the appendices as a historical document with all the place names. I think it's about 400 to 600 pages, goes through each one, and that can tell you a lot. And then there's a history of how the watershed's been taken care of in the past to help guide us to create a continuity of care that we can continue to strengthen. And then we talked a lot about Konohiki principles and how we need to return to that kuleana and ownership about your responsibility with the water system. And then watershed restoration, of course, was a top project, and we went into more detail on that. So the key themes, broadening out the lens a little bit more, were again, community control, cultural integration, education, sustainability, and youth engagement. And it was nice because this really confirmed what we heard in June. So it's always good when you get feedback about that. And my personal biggest overall takeaway was the county really needs to step up and develop its own water resource management system. That's really why the East Maui Water Authority was created. That was the whole movement behind the charter amendment. It's the same movement behind the development of the Department of Agriculture, the county-based one. We're ready to take over and help the state with these duties. And again, we heard that we need to create our own way of taking care of it, our own staff. We need our own expertise, monitoring, and we need to reestablish these cultural-based ways of doing it that employs local knowledge and local staffing to do the work. So with that, I'm gonna, before we turn to getting into our project details, where we can hear your voice, I'm gonna turn it over to our board chair, Jonathan Scheuer, and let him say a few words, and then I'll let him introduce Xavier, or you can give it back to you.
I'll give it back to you. Hello, my Cool. So again, my name is Jonathan Likeke Scheuer, and I have the honor of serving the chair of the Ahawaiʻa Maui Kino, or the East Maui Regional Community Board, which is the governing authority over the East Maui Water Authority. And so I'll just say a few remarks about giving us a little bit more context of why we're here and why it means so much to be at this point in the discussion. I want to first start though by recognizing where we are physically today. It's interesting. I have been in a lot of water discussions in this room over the last couple of decades. As recently as last Friday, I was a couple doors down in the Cameron complex talking to the Ka'ipukui fellows who happen to be looking at VI this year and how East Maui water issues are being adjudicated, hearing from all sorts of stakeholders. On October 2023, we were in this room, which was packed and overflowing with hundreds of people outside. The first time the State Water Commission came to Maui after the Lahaina fires and after They had suspended the state water code and done a whole bunch of things that were really injurious to the people of Maui Kumohana. And, 20 years ago, I was in discussions here as the community was petitioning the Commission on Water Resources Management to designate the Waiha as a water management area so that there could be better management. So this complex, these rooms have a lot of history of important Wai discussions. And I just want to know too, the complex is named after Walter Cameron, an unquestionably generous philanthropist who did so much for Maui, but whose wealth was based in part from an older water system, which really came at the expense of native and local and rural communities to generate great wealth for many other people and prosperity. And so I kind of mention that because it's in that context that the charter amendment passed in 2022 by the voters of Maui County, 64%, most popular thing on the ballot, other than our Lahaina council member. Tamara got more votes, but everybody else was lower than the charter amendment to create the East Maui Water Authority. And it was really the first time actually in Hawaii's history since the closure of plantations across Hawaii that the people of a community said collectively, they didn't turn to a private sector entity. They didn't turn to an existing state agency like the Agribusiness Development Corporation. They turned to themselves and they said, hey, we think we're capable of coming together as a community and managing this most important water system, the single largest water system on the island of Maui. And they created the board. So I'm the chair of the board. I represent Department of Hawaiian Homelands. There's 3 seats that are specifically laid out for representatives or expertise in that sense. One for a watershed expert, one person representing water user in the delivery area of the system, and then from each of the 4 former license areas from the Board of Land and Natural Resources, we have 2 representatives, and so we're an 11-member board. And one thing I want to highlight for you, the fact that this passed and we finally got seated. So the first time in over a century, there's a governmental body truly representative of the people of Maui Hikina with a specific charge to talk about water for Maui Hikina. The first time in 150 years, really, that has happened. And so that's a monumental thing in and of itself, and to be able to take these steps is really important. That said, the journey has not been easy, and while it is super exciting to be here talking about what projects we want to implement at this time, as Gina indicated, the State Board of Land and Natural Resources is preparing in mid-November to possibly take an action which would eviscerate our ability to move forward with our mission. And in fact, for the 2.5-year history of our existence, there's been political and other efforts against us nearly constantly. And my vice chair, our board vice chair, Kyle Makanilua, shared with us the story of Umia Liloa. If you don't know who he was the son of Liloa, a high chief of Hawaii Island, and he was the one who was responsible for actually uniting Hawaii Island and really governing it very justly and prosperously for a long time. But Umia Liloa, Umi, the son of Liloa, was not the firstborn son of Umi. Umi had a royal marriage. He had a child. His firstborn child was expected to inherit the throne. But then Umi fell in love with another. They had a child. And when the male child was born, he gave to the mother of the second child 2 royal tokens, a length of kapa for a loincloth and a leiniho palawa whale's tooth pendant, and said, okay, when the time is right, he can present these and present his claim to the throne. And really that is, we are sometimes refer to ourselves as the bastard child in all this, who everybody's trying to kill. 2 years old, not entitled to the throne, right? The existing system is like, no, of course the corporation's going to take it over. The corporation's running for 150 years. Why wouldn't the corporation take it over? And yet the people have said, have given us these royal tokens and said, no, we actually want you to try and take it over. And that's really the stage that we're at, and so why it's so important to be here today. So thank you so much for being here and for having me. Aloha.
Jonathan, that was great context of that story. Okay, so next I want to introduce Xavier Iris from the engineering firm Woodard and Current. He is a technical advisor to our department and has been a huge asset in helping us understand the more engineering aspects of managing water resources and the system. I'm going to let him tell you more about his background. And he's here to provide technical information and share with us what other places do. And he'll also be helping facilitate a session on water infrastructure. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Gina. So I'll only use the mic if it's helpful. Okay. So I will recap a little bit what Gina already said. Who am I? Why am I here? And I'm not here to announce that I've studied the system and I have not at all. Actually, I'm really here to but I thought it might also be helpful for you to benefit from some of the things that I've seen over 40 years of work in the water industry in California. I think California is Hawaii. In fact, there's a lot of important differences, but I think I also see a lot of themes. You know, I've been doing this since sometime in the 80s, and I've seen a lot of the same changes in California that you're experiencing in Hawaii, including, for example, increased value on in-stream flow uses. In California, for a long time, that was really kind of an afterthought. And so a lot of the current tensions in California have to do with how do you accommodate this thing that, was seen as kind of, oh, where did this new user come from? It's called the environment that now needs to be accommodated. So that's going on in California, and increasingly it's creating conflict where you have systems that now aren't delivering as much water as people expected to some of the historic uses, whether it's ag or M&I or whatever. So that's going on, and I think that's kind of similar here. Something not everyone knows about California is that actually there is enough water in California, depending on what your perception of it is. You might think of California as, maybe you've seen the beaches. Okay, well, that looks like enough water, but it's the wrong kind. Or you see skiing. Well, that's one part of the state where there's actually plenty of water. But most of the state, if you just had to say, well, what is it generally? Look at the map, actually, with Google Earth, and you see, okay, it's semi-arid, which means there's patches of desert, there's patches of nearly desert. And then up in the north, where actually I live, there tends to be more water. So the areas where there's more water tend to have water exported for areas where there's less water. Does that sound a little familiar? So that happened in the 20s. I think it happened here even earlier. But the idea of moving water from areas where it's relatively plentiful to areas where it's not, and that can work for a pretty long time. And then it comes under increasing stress. And one thing I talked about is, I think, the growing appreciation of how important it is to keep those in-stream uses. The other is that you might have a series of close calls and you realize, well, maybe it's actually been broken all along and we didn't really realize it. And then maybe a third piece is, and it's probably getting worse, that we've gotten some, I think some worrisome trends where for the last 20 years in California, we used to say, oh, there was the drought. Oh, actually, then here's another drought. And it really, in hindsight, it seems like one big 20-year drought is what we've just had, with a couple of episodic wet years in between. And I think that's also the case here, where in hindsight, you realize, yeah, it's kind of things we would have used to call a series of little droughts. Maybe it's better viewed as there might be some fairly lengthy dry patches. So even if on average, you got lots of water, and you've got areas here on the island that have 400 inches a year on average. But average doesn't really help. If, let's say, you're trying to cross the Mississippi and you realize that the average depth is only 6 feet. Well, that's comforting until you realize, well, the deepest part is way too deep. And in the case of water, if your driest year is virtually no water at all, well, it doesn't comfort you much that your average year is 400 inches or 200 inches or whatever. California has the same problem. So in most of the kind of runoff producing part of the state, 60 inches of water equivalent. Some of it comes as snow, some as water. That's about what they get. Way more than you need. The average year is twice as much water as you need. For over 30 years, I worked at one utility and I got to know that utility pretty well inside out. And so these are pretty solid numbers, but they're also representative of other places I've looked at through the state. Every place I've helped them figure out, well, what's going on with our water supply and what are the options? They're all different, but there are some common themes. And often it's that yeah, in your average year, things are fine. In the wet years, they're more than fine. You're refilling if you have any storage. So it's really all about the dry years. So yeah, I think people can draw false comfort from, yeah, on average, things are great, but maybe not. I mean, one utility that I worked at for a long time, they had 23.76 inches of rain in an average year, very, very precise. But in fact, the important part is, what does a dry year look like? And can you get through a dry year? Or when I worked in flood control, can you get through the wet years? It's those extremes that usually matter. I think that's true here. So and this gets me to, okay, that's who am I? I've been working in California for a long time, and I've seen different things work or not. When I think about strategies and how you pick a strategy, I think it's sometimes it's how well is it going to work under stress? Because it's not how well does it work in the average year, but how's it going to work in a dry year? And so that tends to be a common theme when you look at all the projects that some utility might do. And usually they're trying to solve some kind of water supply. Either there's just plain not enough for those dry years. In the past, it used to be they needed to accommodate growth. That's less common now, just as here. Your problem is not so much growth as reliability. So I guess that's one theme, to shape strategy. I wanted to say, think about reliability as a really an important thing, not just what's the cheapest, what's the fastest. Well, those are important things, but it's got to work. Whatever you do, it's got to solve the problem. So if that problem is for the number of potential uses of the water, there's in the dry years, there's not enough. And of course, everyone representing their perspective would say, well, one solution is shift who gets how much of the pie. And to a degree, that can work. And I think that's recognizing in-stream uses as a priority use. That's definitely part of that. But I think if you can grow the pie effectively by look at things that could effectively grow the water supply, I think that's a universal thing I've seen. Virtually every agency I look at, okay, well, what's your whole range of options? You could do more of what you're doing. Like if you got wells, drill more wells. If you have surface water, it's impounded behind a dam, well, you can make the dam bigger. If you're buying water from outside, well, you could buy more water. You can always do more of what you're doing in theory. But one thing that is also true, everywhere I've looked, is you could also probably waste less water. And that means look at things like leaky pipes. And the good news is in a drought, they can be easier to find. So, I've been on the maybe receiving end of, hey, you're telling us to fix our leaks. What about your leaks? And everybody's got leaks. Every system leaks. But you're looking for, are there significant leaks here where we could actually, by fixing this leak or by using water more efficiently, negate the need for some whole new water supply. Maybe we don't have to buy new water. Maybe we don't have to go build a desalination plant if we just use the water we already have and use it more efficiently. That's always, I would say, the first thing to look at. And there might be a point where you've kind of run that for all it's worth. Most places are not there yet. And so to me, that's a promising strategy without knowing everything. And I've taken an initial look, but the idea of always look first to efficiency, and that's really at all scales. Whether it's in your bulk system, reservoirs, canals, things like that. And of course, all of the individual users of the water, you kind of want this applies everywhere in the system, the mentality of don't waste the water. And in a wet year, it may not matter much, but in those dry years, it's going to matter a lot. You want to ingrain that usually, because you don't tell people, well, it's okay to waste water now, and then next year we'll tell you not to. So it's a matter of building it in as kind of part of the way of doing business. Okay, other than water efficiency, what are the things that I see? Given that your average year, you appear to have enough water, you'd say, well, without knowing anything else, if I had just arrived from Mars, I'd say, well, this sounds like a problem that storage can help with. If your average year is good enough, that means by definition, almost, there is some amount of storage that would get you through. But storage has all kinds of negative things as well. It's costly. It has usually, there's an environmental impact that comes with it. And that depends on what the storage is, but I'm talking about big storage. It's got to be big enough to get you through a dry period. And it can be supplemented with other things, and that might bring it down to a reasonable size. So another theme here is think about not just the silver bullet solution, but usually it's a mix of things that tends to work. For every place I've looked at, it's, okay, we're going to try to use the water more efficiently, and here's how we're going to do that. And if we need more storage, here's some ways we can address that. And there might still be a deficit, but usually it's you look at chipping away at the problem rather than one thing that's just going to solve it all. I think you might think about it as, well, why do you do that? You're probably not going to put all your eggs in one basket, because whatever your grandest plan is, there's no guarantee it will come to fruition. So you kind of push on a few fronts. Some of them are going to work faster and simpler, and they'll give you those kind of quick, immediate benefits. Some of them might take a long time. You're not sure if they're going to work. I think that's the nature of it. There's some uncertainty. And so we're talking about strategy here. And I think the strategy is look at it as a multi-pronged solution, not just one silver bullet. I hope that's helpful. Like I said, I'm not here to say, this is your ideal mix of projects and here's how you ought to do them. I do hope to be able to give Gina advice like that, but after knowing more what I'm talking about your own problems and your own system. And so that's why I'm here today. For the rest of today, I hope to listen more than talk, but thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. And I will follow that theme. I think our team, just as much as we're here to impart knowledge to you, also really is eager and excited to learn. And often it's our favorite part of being here. So what I'm going to talk about on the heels of this great presentation is how do you fund what's important, and particularly with the really relevant context that Gina has shared. And obviously your board chair saying, the headwinds might really shift in November. Is it possible to say, what if we took any one of the projects that has come from community voice? Could it still survive, be funded, and be a really valuable incremental step towards a North Star that at some point is different? And in order to ground this conversation in a real project, I'm going to follow the example of the Create a Community Base Yard as the one, say, like, if we were doing this project, what would it look like? And how do you use finance strategically and creatively to not just say, hey, we paid for that thing, it was realized, but specifically to saying we did it in a way that actually furthers community control, cultural integration, education goals, sustainable funding, so that it doesn't go away if, let's say, something happens in the future that continues to bring privatization to the table, and where we have engagement and pathways for the generation of leaders that you want to see at the table. So this is a question that I'm holding and that I'm hoping you all will help us think through is, when you surface these priorities, how do we do it and actually say we've realized community benefits? Because that's not easy. And if I stood here and just said, hey, I'm just going to give you a financing strategy, that would not be enough, because it's not enough to say this is just how we're going to pay for something. And as you see, financing is just one of 5 pillars, and there could be so many other things we could add to this slide of what matters to actually realize the kind of work that you're talking about here and the vision that's taking shape. And I will ask you to also audit these and say, what else should be on this slide? Because as we've worked with as many governments as we have throughout the country for years, we see these 5 practices that we think could be really germane to you in creating a plan of finance that is community informed. And one, obviously, community engagement. So after I stop talking, we're going to go to my favorite part of this event, and my colleague Katie is going to lead you through a highly interactive exercise, cost assessment, understanding that it matters to actually think about the full cost of what you're hoping to realize. How do you bring money to it? And then how do you think about those priorities with strategic alignment to all the other things that are happening in the political and government ecosystem, including all of the pieces that are held within engineers, as Xavier talked about and others, so that the things that you're talking about feel like they're situated well and strategically to succeed. And then how do you take actions within that implementation period that don't just forget all the good work, but still really have a commitment to carry it forward? And before I go into the plan of finance for the base yard, I'll go into a little bit of what we mean when you see these 5 pillars, and please raise your hand if any of you have questions. But community engagement, really, you embody what we think this pillar means, not just in saying we're going to create a space, as Gina has done, for folks to come together and say, this is what matters to me and my heart and mind when I think about my history with these projects, but also the fact that we're then going to force you to look at everybody's sort of collective priorities and actually rank and vote and say, how would you filter this list? How do you actually surface and make visible what might be most important when you think about your neighbor and their aspirations and experience? Cost assessment, often this falls within the finance team or individuals who are charged with creating multi-year capital plans for an inventory of assets that we might not even surface in our conversations. And it's important to think about not just like the direct cost of doing the thing, but also the indirect costs, including intangible. Could there be things that you have to invest in to mitigate environmental impact, harm, safety? Xavier really brought up a number of pieces that could help us round out our thinking of things to say, I didn't know I could think about that being an important thing to fund when we stand up or improve that asset or part of the system. And also, if you think about what Gina said, even in talking about the base yard, projects don't just happen one and done. They take years. They need to be sustained over time, right? We don't want to see them go away. You have to think about the multi-year cost and whether or not, even though it looks like a physical asset, does it have operating expenses? Does it need staff? And how do you model in almost an all-in budget for that to succeed? Strategic alignment, we think obviously the more that your priorities are going to be vetted, somebody somewhere, maybe in November, we'll know who, is going to make a list and say, these are the things that matter to invest in. It behooves all of us to have transparency around the strategic plans that are taking form and are being shaped so that you could say, wait a minute, what matters? It could be sort of that step above my priority so that you can build narratives and specifically think about how do you situate your objectives within fiscal health, asset condition, deferred maintenance, all the things that might be on the hearts and minds of leaders who are going to be making the allocation decisions around funding. And also considering that in that strategic alignment, if there is a vacuum that does not say, we care about people, we care about place, you want to push for that, because otherwise community benefits that are not being measured and actually realized probably aren't written somewhere if they just stay in this room. Feasible and sustainable funding. We're going to go into this in depth, maybe to your chagrin, and actually say, what does it mean to bring money to the project? Because not all dollars make sense. We know that there's been a real history of extractive practices and a lot of harm that we don't just assess, but that you've told us has happened because of the way that the system has been funded at a macro level. When you make choices, and by you in this participatory process, you could have a voice around saying, like, this is how I think we should pay for things, and I encourage that. Leaders are going to do that too. And there are some practices that even though they look like they bring money to a system, at the end, they can actually undermine the very values that you're trying to hold and that we've seen Gina and others are committed to if you don't audit the plan of finance and say, what are we doing here? Who's going to be impacted? Who's burdened? If we think about rates and fees and locking in financial vehicles, as you've seen with privatization for 30, 40, 50, and even longer durations. And finally, implementation and action. So obviously, when you actually say, yes, people think that this is fundable. Yes, we should do it in this way. The way that you do it really matters, from how you think about procurement, who is staffed, who shows up to do the work, and whether and how you have an open and clear process that is accountable towards monitoring progress. Because guess what you don't want? All the brain power and collective energy of this room to basically rise to the top of saying the project gets done, but nobody knows if we move the needle and we actually achieve what you hope for as a community. And if the hoped for path has been realized, if nobody's measuring anything. And I know that was like a speed walking through these 5 pillars, because I know that we really want to get to the heart of the meeting, which is with you guys. And before I turn into how would we fund the base yard if we really believe that this 5-step framework strategy resonates? Are there any questions about this? And does anybody think anything is missing? Would there be a pillar that you would add? And all is welcome. Yes, Dick.
Relationship to the county.
Relationship to the county.
Whether the county council, the water department, the structure and interrelationship of these things. Who has authority, what the rules will be governing, what decisions the water authority can make, as opposed to what the county will still want to keep hold of if it all comes fast.
Yeah, that's excellent. And we're going to situate what Dick said within a big corollary of strategic alignment, but also governance. That's not on this slide. How do we set a governance framework and know like what's going to be the arrangement of the ecosystem of actors right around this thing that we want to do? Because we want to audit how that's going to look towards differently than it does in the present within a future that everybody hopes for, as Gina outlined. So thank you for adding that. Anybody else want to add beyond governance? And I don't know how to look for a raised hand, so I apologize if somebody here has their hand raised. Okay. Thank you. I'm not a technology wizard. All right. So if we add this governance piece, let's say, how would we build a sustainable implementation and action plan for the base yard? Because, and I will tell you, to not give away the rest of the meeting, you're going to go through the community engagement piece, which we're very excited about next. So let's see if you agree this is a priority. How would public finance help you? And for those of you who are new to public finance, it's not scary. It gets really difficult. But if you learn this, you'll learn a lot, which is it's nothing more than the field and body of work that says this is how government raises and spends money. That's it. It gets complicated, but this is really what it's about. It is something where government makes the choice to actually invest in how. And then, as Dick said, it really matters to say, well, where's the county in all this? And where does the money come from? And where does the authority sit within a county? Because it's really unique that in your charter amendment, obviously, the authority is almost like a county functional department. That's a big benefit because there is a nexus between the revenue stream of the county, its powers to go to market with instruments I'm going to talk about, which is different than other water authorities in the US that are set up with their own enabling acts, separate charters. Even though, there is certainly, it's Article 8, Chapter 19 of the RISE Charter that specifically governs the authority, but there's a real close connection and nexus legally. The framework of fiscal governance, sort of like where the seat of powers to raise money comes from, that can be very advantageous. And the opportunity to create and to think about the contours of a regional water fund also could be really advantageous, particularly in trying to think about incremental steps away from a history of privatization, despite what could happen in November. And if you've never looked at the county's revenues, this is where the county itself raises money. So if you look at this pie chart, there's something called the general fund and the governmental fund. Think of this as nothing more than like the biggest bank account of the county looks like this. If you were to think of your bank account, think of your biggest bank account. And right now, the county's governmental fund, which is like the biggest pie that the general fund sits within, is, like many governments, heavily dependent on what's called own source revenues. Yes, question in the back. Right, exactly. And that's separate from the authority, but because the authority is created almost as like a functional component unit of the county, it can draw upon this, which is really rare because normally just what you described is the way that water systems are funded, which is system revenues that are segregated totally and for very good reason, right? Separate from the general fund. Why? Because you don't want you want system revenues to benefit the system, right? So yes.
Can anybody hear me?
Appropriations. Yeah, and that's an excellent point. So here you've created this water authority to have like this weird and very positive mix of powers, as you point, is not fictional, and also have this separate division that is almost like system rate funded as traditional, water systems in America exist. So what do you do with this? Because this actually is going to create a very unique opportunity when we talk about the base yard. So if you've never heard of public finance and you say, how can any government fund anything? I'll tell you. The 5 things on the left hand of the slide will cover any government in the world. This is the tool chest. And you're either going to do things on a pay-as-you-go basis. And that means you pay for things as you go. You use real-time money. And it could either be money from the general fund, money from the governmental fund, money that specifically sits in an enterprise fund for system revenues where it's totally separate. But you basically pay things like as if you never had a credit card. And many governments do this. In addition to that, many governments, including the county, have experience with municipal lending instruments, bonds, notes, commercial paper. This is where you borrow money from investors, but you don't bring them in with the level of control that Mahipono and others had. They come in just true as investors. They want a return of principal, they want a return of interest, but you kind of ring fence their power to basically just kind of giving you the cash, and you basically have a loan, have an obligation for a really long time or a really short time, depending on how that deal is structured. You also have philanthropic investments. That could be from corporations, from foundations that basically are mission aligned and give you a grant, or as we're going to talk about, a social investment, a different way of showing up with their mission alignment that can contribute to the way that you widen this public finance, like series of steps. Then there's public-private partnerships. And you have experience with this, right? Because you have a living public-private partnership right now in your water system. And what defines a public-private partnership are 5 ingredients as if we were cooking. It's when you bring in a private party and they're not just like lending you money like municipal bonds. There is joint either design, build, operating, finance, and maintaining of a system or asset. one or more of those 5 things has to be present for it to be a public-private partnership. It's often done through contract, and it can take many, many forms. And then land value capture. When you actually think about land, your biggest asset, and consider how can that actually create channels and pools of reinvestment, often thinking about strategic use of the developer community. And it's a family of instruments. It's really broad and diverse. Any questions about this? Because I'm going to ask you a really hard question is, how do we combine pieces of this and say this is best fit for the base yard? If we not just want to fund it, but we want to do it with a commitment to what you think is important. Xavier?
How does grant funding fit in?
So grant funding could be philanthropic, right? Because that's where a philanthropist comes in and writes you a big check. But grant funding can also be intergovernmental revenues that fund a pay-as-you-go strategy, where let's say there's the state and the county that say, hey, we're going to pass down money to this lower government, or even to the East Maui Water Authority as a functional department of the county, and you don't have to pay it back. So grant money basically would fit within the governmental fund or the general fund under what's called other revenues, money that's not raised, but that is dependent upon another government or a corporation or entity giving it to you. So you don't have control to control the base, the rate, to collect it from your residents, if that makes sense. Yes.
For future questions, when you raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic just so people on Zoom can also hear.
Okay, great. Thank you. So really quickly, if I was a betting person and I say, for the base yard, I might pick these 3 things and think that these 3 are going to give you the money you need and the requisite control to say, despite what happens in November, you can lock in community governance and how and why do I think that? Blending and braiding different public finance approaches is optimal because guess what? Projects need sustainable funding. Guess what? You might need that to persist different political headwinds. And guess what? You also might have a real opportunity to be creative with a philanthropic investor and say, hey, I don't want a grant. I want you to invest differently in this community because you believe that water is vital to healthy communities everywhere. I think this might be off. Yeah. And the other thing is when you do public financings that are creative, people often are less likely to innovate, but the county actually has a history. And again, this is because the authority is a functional department with both of the instruments, pay as you go and municipal lending, that's really deep and shown to proven to be very successful. So combining that with a more expansive and novel strategy could actually be really creative in that it's stays on the path of what you've done, but also brings you a new and different competitive edge and way to approach those strategies. So Gina went over this. So you want to make sure that you hold personnel, equipment, an equipment loan program, scientific support infrastructure as the things you might want to fund, right, for the base yard to be operational. These are very different things that are both of an operating character and capital investment infrastructure. So if I were to ask you from 2025 to 2029, what might be the things that you actually invest in to get the base yard going? What might you say? Staff, what else? Location, might you need equipment, right? For at some point having that equipment loan program, what else?
And anything for preparing the watershed.
Preparing the watershed, right? You might need the physical structure for the base yard, almost like a community center, right? The land, unless you have it. Or it might need maintenance, right? You need to, keep it up and think about invasive species plants even in the area. What else?
Systems of resources.
Right?
Existing county equipment, county lands, other facilities that you can bring integrated into the system.
Excellent. Yes. He rounded out the list, but there's so many other things. We might need paper clips. We might need paper for the desk. We might need light, keeping the lights on, right? A whole bunch you might need a car. Yes. Well, we haven't decided, we haven't gotten there yet, right? We haven't said who's funding it because remember, East Maui Water Authority is a functional department of the county. Could the county fund it? Maybe. Right now, we're just building the components and putting them on a timeline. Yes.
Right now, I get the idea that you're saying we should create this ahead of time so that we're already showing what we're going to be doing as a community when they start to have those discussions about who should run it.
That's going to be a question for you guys. I'm showing you how to create the pie, right? I'm like the chef here trying to show you how to create the recipe.
Well, I want
All right. So this is what you might do, right? If we had to say in a fictitious world, I'm building a base yard and I have 5 years to do it. Thank you. You might have to design the project and actually write it out. You have to at some point decide if you lease or purchase all that equipment. You might have to decide the facility, grounds, infrastructure, how's it going to be secured and financed. You have to create the loan program and hire somebody to run the loan program, right? And decide, well, if somebody breaks the equipment, what do we do with it? Do we replace it and how? You want that scientific monitoring program established. You have to design that intellectually, that hire the scientists, right? Or engage them as consultants. You have to then, once the whole base yard is up, and this is just purely fictitious because I don't know anything about running a base yard, but you also say at some point we declare victory, it's up and running. And then we need to make sure that the operations of the base yard are sustained, right? That the physical facility doesn't fall apart and that we actually invest in keeping it up. So it's not a one and done. It serves the community for years. And I've color coded this, right? Because their operating expenses in orange, which mean that that's like keeping the lights on, people's salaries, right? The scientist's salary, consulting fees or whatever, however you structure that. And capital expenses, things that could be like equipment, brick and mortar, the land, keeping it up and ancillary costs. And it matters to separate those two things as a data point because guess what? Not all public finance money in my beautiful chart can be used the same. And let's say if I said, okay, maybe the base yard for 5 years, I need $3.5 million, a number I pulled out of thin air, right? To do all those things on that chart. If you were to say, well, should the county pay for it, as the gentleman in the back said, or the East Maui Water Authority, who do you think should pay for that? And should you pay for it all at once, like as if you didn't have a credit card? Anybody? Would you want to just take the 3.5 million across those 5 years and say, hey, we're going to commit that every year, every dollar that it takes to do all these things and other things to build the base yard should come out of our money, whether it's the general fund, the governmental fund, or maybe an enterprise fund, depending on whether it's the county or the authority who does it. Sit with that question. Think about it. Because if it was me, I would say there's no way that even if I had $3.5 million sitting in the bank, I'd want to just spend it as real-time cash because there might be other things that are important, especially if we take over the water system, there might be deferred maintenance and all these other pieces that Xavier is going to educate you on that must be done for the water system to work. And if you want to say this doesn't get lost in the shuffle, what might you do? You broaden the way you fund it so that you can lock in multiple years of funding, because if all you do is pay as you go, which is you just annual appropriations, right? You might have the risk that this project dies on the vine or starts and then can't have enough resources to continue. But if you leverage a wider strategy, you could say, well, wait a minute, what if we take municipal bonds and we pay for the things that are equipment and infrastructure, and we take those big costs, which tend to be the biggest budgetary stressors, and we fund them a different way. And those investors are not going to come in like Mahi Pono. No way. They're not going to tell us how to run the system. We're going to run the system in this base yard. They're going to lend us money and we're going to make good on those obligations. And what if I told you that by approaching a philanthropic investor, you could actually build the capacity to come to those investors on the best capital efficient terms and say, we have somebody supporting us who also really believes in this work. They're going to stand behind us if we fall in hard times and cannot pay. So you take out that risk. That's called a guarantee. A credit enhancement, which has never happened, well, happens in America through private sector forms, but part of what we're doing in this program is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is interested in GINA and other governments who care about this work enough to actually say, could they be your backstop? Again, something that a foundation has never done, but is at the edges of the emergence of social investment, a different way for philanthropists to come to the table. It's not a grant. And the other piece that would do for you is it lessens the money you might need from that 3.5 million, if that is the right number, to fund the operations on a pay-as-you-go basis, because typically that's how operations are funded. And you actually would then remove that budgetary stressor and really set up this project to succeed. The other piece that it would give you is possible sustained continuity, because municipal bonds are long-dated instruments. This is where infrastructure is locked in with 30, 40 years of funding. Imagine the ability to say the base yard is going to be here for 30 years because we brought in an instrument that actually takes out the risk that somebody could come in and change their minds about the project, and an investor whose mission also is committed to that result. So basically what I did is kind of segregated the way that you could, with a wider strategy, fund all the color-coded pieces of that chart in a way that also commits to your vision. And obviously nothing is without consequences. So there are pluses and minuses to every strategy. And I'll only go for one more minute. of these, but basically you want to do these strategies thoughtfully. You want to make sure that when you think about who should be the pay-as-you-go payer, county or the authority, you think about where are those funds going to live? Is there any risk, particularly appropriation risk, where you might have a year where money's not allocated and the project suffers? And you'll have these slides, so I won't go into these in detail. And with municipal bonds, one of the pieces you also want to think about is the presence of a guarantee, if it's granted, could really create the best conditions to come to market. Bonds are a great tool that, if done correctly, can achieve intergenerational equity, i.e. the project is well funded for a really long duration because of the nature of that pledge. But you never want to have a system, if, for example, it's a deal that's supported by rate structures, or dependent upon, rate increases, that you then have something that happens that is extractive to the community. Like, rates have to increase to make sure we can pay the bonds back, because then that hurts the very community this project is intended to serve. And the way you safeguard that is by asking questions, auditing and naming these things and saying, we're committed to this not being the future of how this is done. And that's the work that we do. And beyond that, and I'll close at this slide, having money come in that's the right money, sustainably and with the right values, is often not enough. Many governments that we work with and others across the country are actively, they create, community benefits plans that are written, where they say, this is what we want to realize, particularly in government-led projects. And if any of these projects like the Base Road and others are going to be led by private sector actors, you can actually have them write community benefits agreements and enter into them with you, or community workforce agreements that actually commit private sector stakeholders who come in as your partners to the outcomes that you share, and to audit that process with you and say, are you ready to deliver beyond just standing up the project on the things we hold as important? So with that speed tour of public finance, I will invite my colleague Katie to come up here, because part of what we hope to do, and I'll take your questions, is invite you to learn a little bit about what the path forward could look like, and to see public finance as a catalyst for everything you hope could be realized in this room in different ways, and to begin that conversation with knowledge. So any questions, and then I'll turn it over to Katie. Yeah.
I visualize the water authority to be like a wholesaler. I think we have to think, what is the kind of operation we're going to be having? They're going to be getting the water, and they're going to be selling. They're basically 3 customers only. We're not talking about distributing to every residents of Maui. They sell it to the county water department, the Department of Water Supply. They can sell it to Mahi Pono, and they can sell it to Hawaiian homeowners. There may be some smaller ones, but those are the 3 big customers. So in terms of financing and where they will get the revenues to operate the system will come from the fees they charge for the water that they're delivering out there. And I think if we think of it that way, it's water side, which would be the retailer distributed out to the stores and residences. And I think it makes it a little bit easier to conceptualize where the money is going to be essentially coming from to have an ongoing operation.
Yeah, that's a great point. It gets at the comment we had earlier from this woman in the back was saying that traditionally you think of system revenues specifically, so that systems are self-supporting, and often the majority of water systems across America use municipal lending because they create structures that securitize those revenues. So you don't use them on a pay-as-you-go basis. You don't put the money out, right? You actually raise a lot of money up front, and then have the capacity to have system revenues, pay the debt back, which are, revenue bonds, and don't risk the county's general obligations, sort of that big pie that I showed you, and is probably, a very thoughtful strategy that you want to at least consider, right? I'm not telling you if it's the right answer, but, these are all the things that you should consider. So thank you for raising that. Yes.
I'm hesitant to even say this if a big amount is not supportive, but actually I am supportive of this effort. But I think that just for context, it helps to know like the pros and cons or the obstacles you might encounter. As you can tell, I'm a bit of a dinosaur, and I was looking for the water department 35 years ago when we were looking at this question. In fact, a few times when we were looking at this question. And not that I had the authority to make any final decisions, but I was part of the team that was looking. And at the time, among the things that were discussed, number one, BLNR had already, those water licenses were on much more secure footing back then, right? So we weren't as likely to be able to obtain it in the near future. But also, EMI could operate so much more cheaply. I don't know how many of you have ever been out to all of the intakes. But I remember taking a helicopter to the last lower coolant intake and hiking back in. And first of all, the helicopter was chopping vegetation as it landed to make room. Second of all, it landed on a little concrete thing. And I was utterly unprepared for this. You had to climb down the ropes to get even to where you could walk. And some of the intakes involved technical climbing that I didn't even dare to do. So we're not talking easy terrain here. You need people who know the terrain, who are used to managing it safely. And when we looked at the operational costs of hiring people and ensuring them, the county level benefits and all of that, like it was hands down very, very clear that EMI was doing it way more cheaply than we could. And also way more safely because they had people who hunted there, grew up there, knew every inch. You know what I mean? And so all of this is still going to be an issue, right? And I'm not saying that we should try it. I'm just saying be aware that it's not just so easy. Like operational costs are going to be real, and ensuring workers and workers' comp and the kind of accidents that can happen, and installing safety, all of that's going to be very real. For this project.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I don't believe that's naysaying. That's why we're putting these things on the pillars, because we think that where communities are empowered to know that, like, hey, don't just tell us what you think and vote, but like to be able to audit and ask questions and be conversant in the real issues, like that's really important. We saw this approach in Dallas, Texas, who we worked with. They said, hey, we're not just going to come to people and say, tell us what you think we should do with the proceeds. They actually educated community about the fiscal processes themselves so that they could understand, well, what is an operating cost? What are infrastructure investments? What's a bond? How does it work? And that way people can be your partner in making strategic choices with awareness. So thank you for raising that, because I think that's part of building support, not naysaying.
So I just want to really briefly, have a small response to the comment, just to assure you, more in the water authority are well aware of the length and the complexity of the system. One thing that often gets left out of these discussions, however, when sometimes that stops the discussion, say, see, there's no way we could ever do this. So I'm just going to share that Agribusiness Development Corporation runs the Waiahole Ditch on Oahu, has a 3-mile tunnel under the Ko'olau Mountains, number of intakes, it's about the same age. There is systems across the Hawaiian Islands, the Molokai irrigation system within this county has a multi-mile-long tunnel taking water from the north shore of the island of Molokai through its system into the reservoir. So we do believe that it is possible for government, as opposed to the private sector, to manage these legacy systems safely and efficiently. Those systems have now been managed for decades by the public sector. So,
yeah, and there's precedent with many water systems who do just what you said. Yeah, effectively. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Kate so we can get to my favorite part of this.
Thank you so much, Lourdes, and thank you everybody for your participation so far. So we are going to move now into that portion of the program of identifying projects to meet community needs. And we're going to do this in 2 topic sessions. So the first, Gina will come up and help us moderate a session of what projects around water system improvements and watershed programs would be helpful for East Maui. And the second is around stewardship, water system ownership and operations that Jonathan will help us facilitate. So as Gina comes up here, the descriptions here for the types of projects we might brainstorm around water system improvements and watershed programs are upgrading the physical infrastructure of the water collection and delivery system to reduce loss, to improve reliability, and to extend its lifespan. And there are programs to protect water ecosystems, partner with existing groups, and create watershed jobs in the East Maui workforce. And we're lucky to also have Xavier here to answer questions that might come up. Gina, thanks.
I have some help though. Stacey's going to come up and help me. We have Mary Eliza who's going to take some notes over here. We have Xavier who can answer any more technical questions. This is what we did last night. And we're basically just asking for your comments on what do you think is important when looking at upgrading the physical infrastructure in terms of reducing water loss, improving reliability, extending its lifespan? And then what type of programs do you want to see to protect the ecosystems? What groups do you want to see us partner with? And then the base yard to operations could cover both of those too. So this is really, I'm just pitching it to you, but if you have any questions, we can answer those as well. And then we'll write them down, and then at the end, you can kind of decide what you think are the most important. When I went through the summary of K&I, this is how we got it, was just by kicking it to the community. So it's your turn to give us your knowledge, your wisdom. So it's always tough to get the first person to start, but if we can start with physical infrastructure, what do you think would make the most sense in terms of a project to upgrade it?
What I understand, many of the reservoirs are leaking and needs to be mined and or abandoned and or not maintained. The system itself has miles of unlined ditch, so even though supposedly it's not a major source of loss, and some people will say that it recharges where the loss happens, I think it could be improved as well. We are already in the process of developing large storage on the lower line, Kahului, so that's happening. Yeah, I should let somebody else speak.
No, it's wonderful. We can get back to you too in a little bit. Thank you for coming, by the way. And then we're kind of open to even watershed work too. We kind of threw it all together, and then online too. Feel free. We've got someone monitoring the online too, so you can either ask your question in the chat, or if you want to, we can unmute you and you can participate that way too.
Right now, most people in the public think of the one water line that goes to Kahului Weir for the drinking water. But in fact, there are several ditches coming from East Maui. And probably there needs to be an assessment of each of those ditches. Physical assessment of those, because some of them don't involve county, they go directly into Mahibono agricultural lands.
Yeah, that's great. Did I hear something online?
I was just letting folks know to participate in
Oh, that was easy.
the volume we can have with those experience.
Yeah, okay, great. Anybody else? I can start calling on you. Bill.
I knew you were gonna call him. The one thing that concerns me is that, I don't think our laws are adequate to protect us. In Arizona, was a newscast, the Chinese water company came in, put wells that were deeper and pumped faster, and generational ranchers, wells dried up. I don't believe we have protection for that, just like Arizona does. I think that's something that should go along with this. We can do everything we want to do, and then it's like we're going to do that. Also, we have new problems.
Thanks. And I also hearing that maybe Maui County needs to have some more active role in regulating or managing, I should say regulating, but managing.
County leadership on
County
this
leadership.
issue.
Expertise, staffing.
I don't think anybody sees this as an issue yet, but we know that have a punch bowl, and people go with straws, eventually the punch bowl gets in.
Well, Seaworth just had a meeting, I think it was yesterday, talking exactly about that.
Oh.
Yeah, with the current drought.
Right.
Anybody else on any of those subjects? Anybody online?
Sorry, on that topic of the meeting, I was driving to work today and I heard my deputy director speaking about how, growing up here in years and years and years, he's nobody's ever seen it this dry as it is the ditch. That's the Wailoa ditch. It's never been this. So, yeah, definitely people are thinking of those.
So what do you think the result of that is? Do we need to step up our attention, do more monitoring,
We definitely have it in our budget and our thinking to continue. We already have, at least 3 or 4%, I forget the exact number of our funds go to watershed and resource protection, and then beyond that, studies, ongoing monitoring, and we've been increasing gauges that were systematically decreased by the state over decades previously. So yeah, I mean, we need to step up all of that. And I think CWRM also revisits sustainable yield on a fairly more regular basis now.
Can you share what the department asked, Cohort to do this in January, February, in terms of looking at food, stream flow standards?
Oh, we submitted a request for them to set in-stream flow standards for. It was divided into 8 watersheds, but it was 43 streams and tributaries in the Hamakua-Poko and Hamakua-Loa areas. And that, the purpose of that was, you know, we can't say, since we, well, we're not the only ones, we basically said that we need to manage this resource responsibly, but we have no data with which to do that. We need your guidance, you know.
That sounds like a very proactive thing.
So it's just on that point, thank you for bringing that up. I continually hear that I vision old timers say it's never been like this. Do we have metrics? Do we have in-stream flow from the last 30, 40 years for the ones that we're seeing so dry now?
So I would, in response to that question for anyone in the room or anybody online, so Dr. Aaron Strauch, the chief stream hydrologist for the Water Commission, did a whole presentation yesterday with a bunch of data, both from individual streams, some with over a century of records, as well as showing not just how low stream flow has been, but also, for instance, the number of days that we've had over the past year where stream flow was at or lower than 95% of all stream flows. And so like one of the streams he highlighted, over half the year basically had record low flows. So that data is available on the State Water Commission's website, or on, if you look for the Water Commission channel on YouTube, you can watch the presentation recorded.
The problem is that streams are inadequately gauged. In the area that we requested the IFS for, there are only a couple of gauges. Streams going further east are better gauged, but even there are gauges that have 30-year records, 20-year records, 100-year records. It varies. We do monitor and have, you know, daily what we have our treatment plants that go back I think at least as long as I was there, so going back into the 1996. But that's not the same as stream gauges, right? It's just ditch flows that flows into the plant.
Every problem.
What about rainfall? Data collection too, I understand that there's,
I'm supposed to participate,
you
not
are
take over.
participating.
Okay. So we have rainfall gauges, but when I enter that data, it looks very incomplete to me. There are some rainfall stations up there too. Again, some have better records than others. Some are more maintained than others. Some have been in place and monitored longer or less time than others. But it's the same thing. It's not, we probably don't have the extent of monitoring reliable long-term data that we should. But there are also private companies that kept data for years on their own gauge systems that can be accessed now. So
that actually came up last night as well. One of the first topics that came up when this was brought up yesterday, Kate and I, was about consolidating all of the various sources of information about not just the streams, but also rainfall, taking like private data and the public data and also community level data and synthesizing that into, I think the idea for the project was one master map, and also including Hawaii systems, both like currently functioning Hawaii systems and formerly functioning Hawaii systems, and kind of ranking them as which ones are eligible or feasible to be restored and which ones aren't. Water system improvements last night.
I would I would have, you nailed it very well, but I'd expand it and say that we need a hydraulic model for the system, which would indicate all the ditches, their capacity, would indicate reservoirs in the system. It would indicate elevation. One thing that has not been mentioned today at all, water at a higher elevation is more valuable than water at a lower elevation. And I think what we need to build in is a model that really looks at the whole system. And notice that if you look at the ditch system right now, there are a number of places where water is allowed to drop from a higher ditch down to a lower ditch as it goes along. I would hope that we would look at, for example, capturing the energy of that drop in water. Those kinds of things. So in other words, if we have a good hydraulic model, the whole system, I think would be helpful to make the right decisions later on.
But Dick knows how to make me really happy because I think he's talking about hydro pump storage, energy systems and integrating that into the water system. That's right.
That's actually specifically written into the charter. Take a look at hydro.
Oh, wow. I was gonna do what Stacy did, but as last night when they talked about hydrology, one of the things that was brought up by the community, and I think this kind of ties in with some of what Ellen said as far as the community capacity or the capacity to take care of the watershed. But one thing that's needed is to be able to translate a lot of what folks like Aaron Strauss say when they're speaking about hydrology, so that the community, which has its own knowledge very firsthand, but is not using those same kind of scientific concepts, can participate and integrate that information. So we're talking about these kinds of maps, et cetera, that it's very accessible to the community because they're the ones who want to do the work.
So like hydrology translators for regular folks.
We used to have, and I haven't seen any lately, but I've only been back for a little while. Feels like a while anyway. But we used to have like schematics of our systems. And like kind of at each level, we had the cost of delivering water from this tank service area, from that tank service area, the other. So, yeah.
It might already exist, is what I'm hearing.
I don't,
Or some form of it might.
yeah, I don't know that it exists for the ditch system though, because we didn't run the ditch system.
This would be the upcountry system, but not the ditch.
Okay.
Can I ask a specific question about support for storage and reservoirs? And those reservoirs would be for not only the Department of Water Supply, but also for the Department of Ag. So as Xavier talked about, you have varying weather and periods of, dry and wet. Are people generally supportive of funding storage? For the record, is that something?
It's the most common thing I hear mentioned.
It's the most common thing you hear mentioned, is that?
Did you get the email I sent you? The email I sent you with the reservoirs. A&B did a study in 2013 where they looked at all their 40 or so reservoirs and the cost of lining them all. And whether, I think, needs to analyze that to see whether it's economical. Just because it costs a low amount, you may not store a lot of water. So you can see that you get bang for the buck in lining reservoirs and perhaps constructing new ones.
So like a cost benefit analysis of lining existing reservoirs versus just building new ones with modern technology.
And tanks.
And
Water
tanks.
doesn't always have to be a hole in the ground. It could be the size of a water tank as well.
That's great. Something else that came up last night was about depth of reservoirs and covers. I would like to bring the things from the other communities into this one to see kind of if there's alignment or.
But one of the things with reservoirs can now be lined with solar panels. It produces energy to get the system operating. It also reduces evaporation.
Great.
And that's done elsewhere in the world. And that's something that we'll definitely would want to look at.
Great.
Thanks, Director. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm late. I just came in from Lennon. You talked about the support for reservoirs. And as you know, the Pula Ag Park water sources from East Maui. Oftentimes, especially with the weather now, there's a increased need for us to rely on the Department of Water to pump. So we're in the process of planning to build a large reservoir because the smaller reservoir isn't enough anymore. And the reason for building a reservoir is not only to have extra storage, but to serve for drought amelioration and for fire. And in the future, we're trying to build another ag park so that we can put our farmers in it. So the additional water reservoir would support both, and the improved infrastructure would just allow farmers to utilize more of the land and, you know, less trouble in the system. And right now we have a lot of silt in, and as he mentioned about the relining, you know, I had to make the decision, I'm gonna reline or we're gonna build a new one. And, you know, relining takes a lot more money and it's already small. And if we want more farmers on the land, you know, we just need more water. So I hope, you know, when the project comes to the council, I hope people, not just Kahului Park farmers, but you know, our general public comes and support when it gets to council.
And can you tell us your lining, what your lining is and why you chose?
So the engineers in water department and the contracted engineers had determined that the best bet would be for now would be the concrete reservoir. And that's the extent I know because it's kind of like in the new phase right now.
Will that help with when sediment drop? It's also becomes a sediment pond if you're using.
Yeah, I think so. The new reservoir is supposed to rise the same time with the small reservoir, is the thinking. So they needed that particular location. So Kahului Park is like hilly, so they had to get somewhere that was very near to that existing water source.
And concrete is what you're gonna.
That's one of the options, so that's what we're reviewing right now.
Oh, you haven't, you're just reviewing.
And it's open basin, yeah.
Great, thank you, thanks. Ready, we got time for a couple more.
We haven't talked much about watershed programs. We talked a lot about water system improvements. So I want to give some time also if anyone has ideas about watershed programs and like ways we can grow more water, recharge the aquifer. Yeah.
Well, in the earlier discussion, I got the idea that that's going to be a very important topic and that that's going to be something that maybe we need to be very well prepared to discuss so that we aren't undermined by misbeliefs and misconstructions. But absolutely, the watershed is essential for the health of the forest and for the health of the birds and certainly to have the water not being taken up by invasives that use 3 to 4 times the water. So I would say that's got to be one of our highest priorities. You know, you hear who's going to do it, and I heard in the presentation earlier that East Maui residents want to be very active in the process. So that's great to hear. Because we need people that are akamai about being on that land. So I think that's a big emphasis in my viewpoint.
Thanks. I knew there were questions about this. The county support this. I'll tell you, the county council was very supportive of this during the last budget process and did actually give us some workers too, so we can get started on it. And we're looking at partnering with the community on it. So not necessarily buying land, but maybe leasing existing land where there's already some infrastructure and maybe some similar work going on too. So there's lots of ways that we can look at it, but it's important to hear to get community buy-in and to hear from the local communities about what they need also and what their expectations are with the nation. So that was a lot of last night too.
They can do it.
Scotty and I am supposed to be more facilitating than contributing, but I want to bring forward some of the early conversations among our board. Two of the principles that Ahavaio Maui Kina uplifted was, one was like, you know, there's this openness to sharing water, but wanting people to be really efficient with water if water is coming out of Maui Kina towards other communities. And also related to that, support more water independence for the communities that have historically developed this reliance on water from Maui Hikina. And so just to highlight that the watershed discussion has largely been about what do we do on the watersheds of East Maui, which absolutely need attention, right? We've lost 90% of the historic forest in Leeward Haleakala, right? So as one of the major water using areas, even though it doesn't necessarily come under the authority's purview, I think a discussion about how you increase forested watershed in Leeward Haleakala as a way of increasing water availability on the island is part of the watershed discussion, not just only focusing on protecting the East Maui watersheds, which is, don't take what I'm saying as saying that that's not super, super important, but I don't want to focus only on that and lose sight of that.
So focus on watershed restoration in areas like Hula and Kahului so that we reduce the dependence upon East Maui as well. So don't be constrained by the name East Maui Water Authority, I guess.
Great. Thank you, Gina and Stacy. Jonathan, while you're on the mic, I'll pull up the next slide here. Okay. All right, so our next topic is on stewardship and water system ownership and operations. And we've queued this up as supporting community control of water resources and developing sustainable practices for managing water. Thanks very much.
Oh, so actually, since you were at some of the other sections, I think maybe first uplifting some of those things first.
Yeah. Gina covered this in some of her PowerPoint, but I'll say the obvious. That community was very passionate about implementing the mandate to control the water system in East Maui, and not using any more delays on that. I think they're getting impatient. I don't hesitate to say impatient, but they were very patient. And as far as stewardship and ownership, just wanting to have like a local presence in East Maui Water Authority presence in East Maui, so we're not having to drive materials along on a highway and all of those things. Having trouble remembering any others, but it was a lot of talk about control of the system.
So I don't know if there's general thoughts people have in response to this prompt that they want to share. One specific question just to highlight the sort of reality of the situation. Like the vast majority of the lands in the Mako water generating lands in Maui Hikina are former Crown and Kingdom lands that were taken at the overthrow. Ownership was asserted by the Republic, then ceded, see the air quotes, to the federal government and then transferred to the state of Hawaii. But that's not all the watershed lands. There's also, there's portions of the ditch system which are privately controlled, and there's portions of the watershed which are privately owned. So just to add a little bit of nuance and get some feedback, is the interest in just the state portions, which are the historic license areas? Is it in the entirety of the system, everything that's currently controlled by the state, as well as everything that's also privately owned?
Well, for me, when I saw the Mahimono buying the land and A&B cut out the EMI as a separate deal, and they valued it at $5 million. I think that's eminent domain. We just have to buy it. There's a price tag on it. If we done eminent domain without them putting the price on it, it would have been a long fight and it would have been big numbers. But I think that was a break for us. We should take advantage.
Eminent domain, that was also right.
$5 million. That's all.
Let's keep it. I think examination could go into looking if there's any state legislation that could be utilized to take, for example, the very top of the watershed, all the lands owned by Mahimono, a large area of water from that land comes down into the leased area, and seeing if there's any way, I'm not sure if there is, but any way to integrate that so that it all becomes a big management area where public lands already owned and private lands somehow get incorporated together, so it can all be treated as one reservoir, so to speak, of water sources for the whole East Maui watershed.
So like using the public and privately owned land to
Right.
create a master like watershed.
Or create an entity that would integrate all of those lands into one unified area that might be better managed rather than having them managed and owned separately.
So I do want to acknowledge, right, there's the East Maui Watershed Partnership, which does try to manage currently some watershed across property boundaries. They do lots of hard work in remote areas and they do have cooperative agreements. So I want to make sure that we're not acknowledging the work that they do. So,
If the East Maui watershed goes into operation as a managing entity.
Yeah.
Those practices should be continued.
okay.
And again, I want to stress, I'm not trying to be a wet blanket, I just want to like raise issues that we might encounter, okay? East Maui Watershed Partnership, and in the past also the West, I mean, now it's kind of divided because whatever. You know, those are private landowners that fund that management. Once that land comes out of their holding, there's a good chance that the funding from them will dry up, so we would have to find other funding. I'm not saying we should, I'm not trying to like the other one, I wasn't trying to use that as a way to say we shouldn't do it, I'm just trying to like. If you want to get from point A to point B, you want to know what's in between, right? So.
I just want to provide a little clarification on that. So all of the watershed partnerships are typically operating under private or in collaboration with private landowners as well as government entities. You know, there are multiple landowners and stakeholders that they're working with, and a lot of the majority of their operations are grant funded from, you know, private small grants to large scale federal grants. So if there's like any kind of soft funding, it's always fluctuating, but you know, they've been pretty successful for the last 20 plus years.
Sorry, let's make sure that for the folks online, we speak into the mic because they'll just be like, something's happening in the room. I have no idea what's going on.
I'm sorry, I was just curious, like, even with the sort of dry up of funding for certain uses that seems to be recent years. We haven't had to get like more funding for state, county and private collaborators versus grants to cover that difference. There's been enough other grant sources. That's still the majority here.
And I do want to I think we're steering slightly off of the, yeah. Yeah.
Like off funded projects, there's those fluctuations and administration and things that you face as well as it continues. So I think I'm just trying to say that, you know, the stability and the work and dedication that the watershed partnerships it's done has been pretty consistent. And they are the first inaugural watershed partnership that started the 10 across the state. So they would be, you know, great resource of partner to look at, and that's stewardship forward.
So I'm hearing, because we're trying to find specific projects, so I'm hearing to write down on our board to look at diverse public finance options for watershed restoration. That includes private, government, landowners, all of that.
However, I would add that what was raised at the meeting last night was a lot of dissatisfaction with the East Maui Watershed Partnership from the community, from the perspective that they did not want to work with the community. So I'm sure there's historic issues, et cetera, but I think going to what the project needs to be is considering all those factors, and is there a better way to bring everybody together, to work together, everybody.
I think what we wrote down last night was to have open access for lineal descendants and non-hosts participate in the watershed restoration was what we wrote down after that long discussion. We have like 2 more minutes if anyone else has.
Yeah, any other comments or questions regarding this topic? I don't see anybody standing up and saying, no, don't fulfill your charter amendment. This is a bad idea. Just for the record. So, yes, Bill.
What's the priority of the groups that are funding the East Maui watershed? I mean, the Watershed Alliance. What's their stake in it?
So, well,
Keep that to the mic. Yeah. Thanks, Stacy.
She said that we should ask the East Maui Watershed Partnership for clarification on these questions. Another thing that came up last night that hasn't been mentioned yet was coming up with like a model of what county-owned water system would look like. Because it's great to talk about it in theory, but there were questions about what does that actually mean day-to-day in real life? Does anyone here have suggestions for that? Because we have a room full of people who are a little more knowledgeable county operations in this room.
I am surprised that he thought he was gonna get a tree asphalt right there. If you ask him, he's sitting change up and
Well,
out
that's
right
the
now.
goodness. I think that's time. Sorry.
Swing and a miss. Came out.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Stacy. And all of you, thank you for the participation. We're gonna move towards wrapping up here. Gina, I'm gonna invite you up, talk about some. Reflecting a bit on the path forward and some next steps for Maui. And just want to thank you all for your time and participation today. Gina will come up and talk about the commitments, but I think the rooting in the community engagement is essential as they're developing strategies to think through how do we take these ideas and then prioritize them and move them into funding. So we'll have another community conversation tonight in Haiku. That starts at 6 p.m. if you want to join us or tell your friends. And then we'll work together with the Public Finance Initiative to help synthesize this information and think about developing an action plan and how we might provide support moving forward. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Gina, to close this out. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming out. Tonight will be a little bit different. It'll be a little more of an interactive work group, and then everybody will prioritize, but we'll bring our results back to you. So what I wanted to end with this is that our commitment to all of you is that we'll continue to take your information like we did in June, and we'll share it with policymakers and other communities so that everybody's hearing the information, and that we'll use what you're saying when we're looking at what types of programs can be developed and then funded. And we'll continue to come back to you for your knowledge and for your guidance. We can't do this work without you. And I also just want to remind everyone that we need your help too, especially when it comes to showing up for policymaking decisions, like what's going to happen November 14th at the BLNR. Really important for them to hear directly from you, not just from me saying, hey, we heard this at a meeting, but also budget time. That's when it's really important, like Director Arce was saying, when she comes up for her reservoir, it's really important for people to send an email of support or to even just come on for the meeting and say, hey, that sounds like a really great idea. And then budget time is always a great time. The mayor just had all of his meetings, but they sent me testimony where people spoke about the water authority. We really do listen to the community. And I can tell you the council sure as heck does too. So just having a couple voices makes a huge difference. I just want you to know that. We do take seriously what you folks have to say. So thank you again, everyone. Really appreciate it and look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you. Oh, and one last thing. I have the Homicide News. If anybody wants to learn a little bit about our cultural work in the library that's coming online, there's an article in there that talks about the report that was done, the thousands of pages of historical documents that will become part of our library and accessible to the public. Thank you.
Ms. Georgia Pinsky publishes that.
I didn't glad. How the business come from?
What's that?
How the business come from? That's what bought it.
That's the last thing.
Yeah.
What?
Oh, she was.
It's great.